You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. This is a reading of 4 lectures by Rudolf Steiner entitled The Easter Festival in the Evolution of the Mysteries. Lecture 1, given on April 19th, 1924. Easter is felt by many to be associated, on the one hand, with the deepest feelings and sensibilities of the human soul, and on the other, with cosmic mysteries and enigmas. The connection with cosmic mysteries becomes clear when we consider that Easter is a so-called movable feast, the date of which is fixed each year with reference to a specific constellation in the heavens. We will have more to say about this in the lectures to come. As for Easter's connection with the human soul, if we examine the customs and rites that have become associated with it through the centuries, we cannot fail to observe the great significance with which a large part of mankind has come to invest this festival. For Christianity, Easter was not important initially, but it became so during the first few centuries. It is linked to Christianity's basic tenet, the resurrection of Christ, and to the fundamental impulse to become a Christian, provided by that fact. Easter is therefore a celebration of the resurrection, but as such it points back to times and festivals predating Christianity. These earlier festivals centered around the spring equinox, an event which, though not identical with Easter, enters into the calculation of its date and celebrated nature's reawakening in the new life burgeoning forth from the earth. And this leads us directly to the heart of our subject, which is the Easter festival as a stage in the evolution of the mysteries. For Christians, Easter commemorates the resurrection. The corresponding pagan festival is in a sense celebrated the resurrection of nature, the reawakening of what, as nature, had been asleep throughout the winter. However, there the similarity ends. It must be emphasized that with regard to its inner meaning, the Christian Easter festival in no sense corresponds to the pagan equinox celebrations. Rather, a serious examination of ancient pagan times reveals that Easter, in the Christian sense, is related to festivals that grew out of the mysteries and that were celebrated in the fall. This most curious fact demonstrates what serious misunderstandings regarding matters of the highest importance have occurred in the course of humanity's development. In the early Christian centuries, nothing less happened than the confusion of Easter with a completely different festival, with the result that Easter was moved from fall to the spring. With this we touch upon something of enormous importance in the development of humanity. Consider for a moment the essential content of Easter. First, the figure central to Christian consciousness, Christ Jesus, experiences death, as commemorated by Good Friday. He then remains in the grave for 3 days, symbolizing his union with earthly existence. Christians observe this interval, the one between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, as a period of mourning. Finally, on Easter Sunday, the central being of Christianity arises from the grave. In essence, then, Easter involves Christ's death, lying in the grave, and resurrection. Let us now turn to one of the many forms of the corresponding pagan festival, for only in doing so can we grasp the relation of Easter to the mysteries. Among many ancient peoples, we find celebrations whose rituals enact a content strongly resembling that of the Christian Easter festival. One of these was the festival of Adonis, which was observed by certain Near Eastern peoples over long spans of pre-Christian antiquity. At the center of this festival stood a likeness of the god Adonis, who represented all that manifests itself in human beings as vigorous youth and beauty. The ancients, in many respects, undoubtedly confused the god's image with what is represented, hence their religions frequently bordered on fetishism. Many indeed took the image of Adonis to be the actually present god, the god of beauty and youthful strength, of an unfolding seminal power that reveals in splendorous outer existence all the inner nobility and grandeur of which humanity is capable. To the accompaniment of songs and rites portraying humanity's deepest grief and sorrow, the god's likeness was immersed for a period of 3 days in the sea, if the mystery site was near the sea, in a lake if it was near a lake, or otherwise in an artificial pond that was dug nearby. For 3 days a profound and solemn silence took hold of the entire community. When, after that time, the idol was lifted from the water, the laments gave way to songs of joy and hymns to the resurrected God, the God who had come back to life. This was an external ceremony, one that profoundly stirred the souls of a great number of people. Even as it did so, however, it hinted at what happened within the sacred mysteries to every person aspiring to initiation. In those times, every candidate for initiation was led into a special chamber. It was dark and gloomy, and its walls were black. The chamber contained nothing but a coffin, or at least something like it. Laments and dirges were sung around this coffin by those who had led the neophyte into the chamber. The latter was treated as if he were about to die. His teachers made it clear to him that by being laid in the coffin, he was to undergo the experience of death and of the 3 days following. The candidate was to achieve total inner clarity regarding those experiences. On the 3rd day, in a spot visible to the occupant of the coffin, a branch appeared, signifying life's renewal. The earlier laments gave way to hymns of joy, and the initiate arose from his grave with transformed consciousness. A new language, a new script were revealed to him, the language and script of the spiritual world. He was permitted to see, and did see, the world from the viewpoint of the Spirit. Compared with these procedures, enacted deep within the mysteries, the external public rites were symbolic, resembling in their form the initiation ceremonies of the select few. At the proper time, these rites, of which the Adonis festival may be taken as typical, were explained to their participants. The rites took place in the fall, and participants were instructed in somewhat the following way. Quote, "Behold, autumn is now upon us. The earth loses its mantle of plants and leaves. All is withering. In place of the greening, burgeoning life that began to cover the earth in spring, snow will now come, or at least a desolating drought. Nature is dying. And as it dies all around you, you shall experience that part of yourself that is similar to nature. Human beings die as well. Each of us has his autumn. And although when life comes to an end it is fitting that the souls of those remaining should be filled with deep sorrow, it is not enough to meet death only when it actually happens. In order that you be confronted with death's full solemnity, that you be able to remind yourselves of death again and again, you are shown each fall the death of that divine being who stands for beauty, youth, and human grandeur. You see that he too goes the way of all nature. Yet precisely when nature becomes barren and begins to die, you must remember something else. You must remember that although human beings pass through the portal of death, although in this earthly existence they experience only things that are like those that die in autumn, at death they are drawn away from the earth and live their way out into the vast cosmic ether, where for 3 days they feel their being expand until it encompasses the whole world. Then, while the eyes of those on earth are focused only on death's outer aspect, on what is transitory, in the spirit world the immortal human soul awakens after 3 days. 3 days after death it arises, born anew for the spirit land." Close quote. In a process of intense inner transformation, the candidate for initiation into the mysteries actually experienced this dying and reawakening within his own soul. The profound shock inflicted upon people by this old method of initiation we shall see that in our day completely different methods are necessary, awakened within them latent powers of spiritual vision. They knew henceforth that they stood not merely in the world of the senses, but in the spiritual world as well. What the students of the mysteries received as timely instruction might be summed up in the following words, quote, "The mystery ritual is an image of events in the spiritual world, of what occurs in the cosmos. The public rituals, in turn, are a likeness of the mysteries." Close quote. No doubt was left in the students' minds that the mysteries encompassed procedures representing what human beings experience in forms of existence other than the earthly, that is, in the vastness of the astral and spiritual cosmos. Those who could not be admitted to the mysteries because they were deemed not mature enough to receive directly the gift of spiritual vision were taught appropriate truths in the cultic rituals, which symbolized what occurred in the mysteries. These rituals, such as the Adonis cult that took place amid autumn's withering, when all of nature seemed to speak only of the transience of earthly things, of the inexorability of death and decay, served to instill in people the certainty, or at least the idea, that death, as experienced by nature in the fall, must also overtake human beings, overtake even the god Adonis, representative of all the beauty, youthfulness, and grandeur of the human soul. The god Adonis also dies. He disappears into the earthly representative of the cosmic ether, into water. But just as he is lifted out of it, so too is the human soul raised from the waters of the world, the cosmic ether, about 3 days after it has passed through the portal of death. The secret of death itself was thus portrayed in the ancient mysteries through the corresponding autumnal festivals. These festivals coincided in their first half with the withering and decay of nature, and in their second half with the opposite, namely, with the eternal essence of the human being. Humanity was to complete the dying of nature in order to recognize that human beings die as well, but that in accordance with their inner nature they arise anew in the spiritual world. The purpose of these ancient pagan mystery festivals was thus to reveal the true meaning of death. As humanity developed, the time came when a particular being, Christ Jesus, carried down into bodily nature the process of death and resurrection that the candidate for initiation had achieved in the mysteries only on the level of the soul. People familiar with the ancient mysteries can peer into them and perceive that neophytes were led through death to resurrection within their souls. That is, they awakened to a higher consciousness. It is important to note that their souls, not their bodies, died, and that they did so in order to rise again on a higher level of consciousness. What aspirants to initiation experienced only in their souls, Christ Jesus passed through in the body, that is, on a different level. Because Christ was not of the earth, but rather a sun being in the body of Jesus of Nazareth, he could undergo on Golgotha, in the entirety of his human nature, what initiates had formerly experienced only in their souls. Those who still possessed intimate knowledge of the old mystery initiation, from that time on to our own, understood the event of Golgotha most profoundly of all. They knew that for thousands of years people had gained knowledge of the spiritual world's secrets through the death and resurrection of their souls. During the process of initiation, body and soul had been kept apart, the soul being led then through death to eternal life. What a number of select people had thus undergone in their souls was experienced all the way into the body by the being who descended from the sun into Jesus of Nazareth at the time of his baptism in the Jordan. An initiation process repeated over many, many centuries became in this way an historical fact. That was the essence of what people familiar with the mysteries knew. They knew that because a sun being had taken possession of the body of Jesus of Nazareth, what had formerly occurred for the neophyte only at the level of the soul and its experiences could now take place on the plane of the body as well. In spite of Christ's bodily death, in spite of his dissolution into the mortal earth, the resurrection could be brought about because Christ ascended higher in soul and spirit than was possible for a candidate for initiation. The neophyte was incapable of bringing the body into such profoundly subsensible regions as Christ did, so that he could not rise as high in resurrection. Except for this difference in cosmic magnitude, however, it was the ancient initiation process that appeared in the historic deed on sacred Golgotha. In the first Christian centuries, very few people knew that a sun being, a cosmic being, had lived in Jesus of Nazareth, or that the earth had actually been made fruitful by the coming of a being previously visible only in the sun for students of initiation. And for those who accepted it with genuine knowledge of the old mysteries, Christianity consisted essentially in the fact that Christ, who could be reached in the old mysteries by ascending through initiation to the sun, had descended into a mortal body. He had come down to earth, into the body of Jesus of Nazareth. A mood of rejoicing, even of holy elation, filled the souls of those who understood something of this mystery when it occurred. Living awareness then gradually gave way, through developments we shall discuss presently, to a festival in memory of this historical event on Golgotha. While this memory was taking shape, awareness of Christ's identity as a sun being grew dimmer and dimmer. Those familiar with the ancient mysteries could not be mistaken about that identity. They knew that genuine initiates, by being made independent of the physical body and experiencing death in their souls, had ascended to the sphere of the sun, and there found the Christ. From the Christ they received the impulse to resurrection. Having raised themselves up to him, they were cognizant of his true nature. From the events on Golgotha they knew that the being formerly accessible only in the sun had descended to mankind on earth. Why? Because the old rite of initiation, through which neophytes had risen to Christ in the sun, could no longer be performed. Over time, human nature had changed. Evolution had progressed in such a way as to make initiation by means of the old ritual impossible. Human beings on earth could no longer find Christ in the sun. For this reason he came down to enact a deed to which earthly humanity could now turn its gaze. This secret is among the holiest things of which we may speak here on earth. What was the situation then for those living in the centuries immediately following the mystery of Golgotha? If I were to draw it, I would have to sketch something like this, and there's a drawing. In the old initiation center, neophytes gazed up to the sun, and through initiation became aware of the Christ. To find him, they looked out into space, so to speak. In order to show later developments, I must here represent time in terms of the earth proceeding along a line from right to left, its subsequent positions from year to year represented by arcs beneath the line, even though the earth does not actually move this way through space. At the left, let us say, is the 8th century. The mystery of Golgotha, cross at center, had already taken place. Human beings, instead of seeking Christ in the sun from a mystery temple, now look back toward the turning point of time, to the beginning of the Christian era. They look back in time toward the mystery of Golgotha, and there find Christ performing an earthly deed. The significance of the mystery of Golgotha was that it changed a previously spatial perception into perception through time. Furthermore, if we reflect upon what transpired in the mysteries during initiation, remembering that initiation was an image of human death and resurrection, and then consider the form taken by the cult, the festival of Adonis, for example, which was itself a picture of the mysteries, then these three things appear raised to the ultimate degree, unified and concentrated in the historical deed on Golgotha. The profoundly intimate rites of the mystery sanctuaries now stood forth as an external, historical event. All humankind now had access to what was previously available only to initiates. No longer was it necessary to immerse an image in the sea and symbolically resurrect it. Instead, human beings were to think of, to remember what actually took place on Golgotha. The physical symbol, referring to a process experienced in space, was to be supplanted by the internal, immaterial thought, by the memory of the historical deed on Golgotha experienced within the soul. A remarkable development began to take place during the centuries that followed. Human beings were less and less cognizant of spiritual realities, so that the substance of the mystery of Golgotha could no longer gain a foothold in their souls. Evolution tended toward the development of a sense for material reality. Human beings could no longer grasp in their hearts that precisely where nature presents itself as ephemeral, as dying and desolate, the spirit's vitality can best be witnessed. The autumnal festival thus lost its meaning. It was no longer understood that the best time to appreciate the resurrection of the human spirit was when outer nature was dying, that is, during the fall. Autumn simply became an unsuitable time for the festival of resurrection, for it could no longer turn people's minds to spiritual immortality by underscoring nature's transience. People began to depend upon material symbols, upon enduring elements of nature for their understanding of immortal things. They focused upon the seed's germinating force, which, though buried in the fall, sprouts forth again in spring. People adopted material symbols for spiritual things, because matter could no longer stimulate them to perceive the spirit in its reality. Human souls lacked the strength to receive autumn's revelation of the spirit's permanence in contrast to the impermanence of nature. Help from nature, in the form of an outwardly visible resurrection, was now necessary. People needed to see plants sprouting from the ground, the sun gaining strength, light and warmth increasing, in other words, a resurrection of nature, in order to celebrate the idea of resurrection itself. But this meant that the immediate connection to the spirit present in the festival of Adonis and potentially present in the mystery of Golgotha disappeared. An intense inner experience that was possible in ancient times at every human death gradually faded out. In those times people had known that although a departed soul's first experiences beyond the gate of death were indeed a matter of solemn reflection, after 3 days the living could rejoice, for they knew that then the departed soul arose out of earthly death into spiritual immortality. Thus the power inherent in the festival of Adonis disappeared. It lay in humanity's nature that this power should at first arise with great intensity. Ancient peoples beheld the death of the god, the death of human beauty, grandeur, and youthful vigor. This god was immersed in the sea on a day of mourning. The mood was somber, for people were at first to develop a feeling for the ephemeral. This mood, however, was to yield in turn a different one. This mood, however, was to yield in turn to a different one, to that evoked by the human soul's supersensible resurrection after 3 days. When the god, or rather his likeness, was raised out of the water, rightly instructed believers saw in it an image of the human soul as it exists a few days after death. The fate of departed souls in the spiritual world was placed before them in the image of the risen God of beauty and youth. Thus each year in the fall, human minds were awakened to a direct contemplation of something deeply connected with human destiny. At that time it would have been deemed inappropriate to convey this by means of outer nature. Truths that could be experienced spiritually were represented in the cult's symbolic rituals. However, when the time came for the ancient physical idol to be replaced with the inner experience of the unseen mystery of Golgotha, a mystery that embodied the same truth, humanity at first lacked the strength, for the spirit had retreated into deeply hidden regions of the human soul. The need to look to nature for symbols of the spirit has continued into our own time. Nature, however, provides no complete image of our destiny and death. And while the idea of death has survived, that of resurrection has increasingly disappeared. Even though resurrection is spoken of as a tenet of faith, the fact of resurrection is not a living one for people of more recent times. It must, however, once more become so through anthroposophical insight that awakens a feeling for the true concept of resurrection. If, therefore, as has been said on appropriate occasions, we as anthroposophists must cherish the Michael idea as a heralding thought, and must deepen our understanding of the Christmas idea, so too must our experience of the Easter idea be particularly festive, for it is anthroposophy's task to add to the thought of death that of resurrection, to become an inner celebration of the resurrection of the human soul, imbuing our philosophy with an Easter mood. Anthroposophy will be able to achieve this when people understand how the ancient mystery concepts can live on in the true concept of Easter, and when once again a proper view prevails of the body, soul, and spirit of the human being, and of the fates of these in the physical, soul, and divine spiritual worlds. The end of Lecture 1. You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. This is a reading of a set of 4 lectures by Rudolf Steiner, entitled The Easter Festival in the Evolution of the Mysteries. This is Lecture 2, given on April 20th, 1924. We can say that the original purpose of festivals is to make human beings look up from their dependence upon earthly things to their dependence upon extra-earthly things. The Easter festival in particular can evoke such thoughts. During the last 3 to 5 centuries, we in the civilized world have undergone a psycho-spiritual development that has made us focus less and less upon our connection with cosmic forces and powers. We've gradually been reduced to contemplating only our relation to earthly forces and powers. Of course, given the means for acquiring knowledge, recognized as legitimate today, this could scarcely be otherwise. However, if in pre-Christian times, or even in the early centuries of Christianity, someone who was connected with a mystery center could have experienced what we moderns call knowledge, and if he were to approach the matter with the state of mind characteristic of those earlier times, he would not at all understand how human beings can live without an awareness of their connection to extra-earthly cosmic things. I would now like to sketch various matters that you will find dealt with more thoroughly in this or that lecture cycle. In the present lectures, as the present lectures are intended to acquaint us specifically with the Easter idea, I naturally cannot elaborate on every detail, but only touch upon the most important points. If we go back to certain ancient monotheistic religious systems, for example to the Hebrew Judaic system, with which we are most familiar, we naturally find the veneration and worship of one deity. That deity is the one of whom we speak in our Christian conception as the first person of the Godhead, as God the Father. Now, all the religions in which the concept of the Father God played a part had a greater or lesser awareness of his connection with the cosmic moon forces, forces that stream down to the earth from the moon. The mystery priests were particularly aware of this connection. In our time, this consciousness of our relationship to the moon has all but disappeared. Perhaps the only place it lives on is in the inspiration of poetic imagination by the forces of the moon, or in medicine, in the counting of human embryonic life in 10 lunar months. But older worldviews were clearly aware that the human being who exists in the spiritual world as a being of spirit and soul is permeated and strengthened by forces emanating from the moon as he descends into earthly existence. If we want to know what shapes our living form, to know what lives in us as nutritive and respiratory processes, as overall forces of growth. We must look not to earth forces, but rather to cosmic forces. For a consideration of earth forces readily reveals their relation to us. If we did not hold our bodies together with extra earthly forces, if our bodies did not receive their form from cosmic forces, how could the earth forces alone hold them together? The moment the human body is forsaken by cosmic forces and exposed to merely terrestrial forces, it falls apart, disintegrates, becomes a corpse. Earth forces can only make us into corpses. They cannot shape us. It is to the influence of the moon that we owe the uplifting forces within us, the forces that give us a cohesive, organized form, a form that during life does not succumb to forces that seize and destroy us at our death. It is due to this that throughout our earthly lives we can resist destruction, as indeed it must be resisted. Although in this way we may say theoretically how the form of our body is dependent upon the forces of the moon, we must also see that these forces, which guide us, so to speak, through birth into a physical existence, were revered by ancient religions as the forces of the Divine Father. The ancient Hebrew initiates knew that the moon radiates those forces that lead us into our earthly life and maintain us there. Our physical being is severed from these forces only when we pass through the gate of death. To look up lovingly to these Divine Father forces, to express devotion to them in ritual and prayer, this was the substance of certain ancient monotheistic religions. And these religions were more consistent than you might think. For history completely misrepresents them, basing itself as it must merely upon external evidence, not upon what can be observed in spiritual vision. Religions that focused on the moon and the spiritual beings living in it were really of relatively late origin. The truly primordial religions had in addition to this a clear perception of the sun forces, and even, it must be added, of the forces of Saturn. However, with this we are entering into a period of history of which no physical documents survive, one that antedates the foundation of Christianity by many thousands of years. In my title, Outline of Esoteric Science, I called this period the Ancient Indian, partly to have a name for it, but also because it took place in the area we now call India. The civilization following this was the ancient Persian. During these civilizations, human beings still developed very differently than they did later, and this is reflected in their religious beliefs. During the last 2,000 years or more, human beings have been developing in such a way that they no longer notice a certain discontinuity in their earthly development, and indeed the break is really hardly noticeable. Something that takes place in human beings around the 30th year today remains largely in the subconscious or the unconscious. However, this was not the case among people who lived 8,000 or 9,000 years before Christ. At that time, a person's development was continuous up until about the 30th year, when a profound metamorphosis set in, which I shall be quite direct in describing. Although what I have to say might sound somewhat strange, it nevertheless fits the relevant facts. In those ancient times, the following could happen. Let us say that before turning 30, a man had made the acquaintance of someone much younger, say 3 or 4 years younger, who would therefore experience the 30th year metamorphosis much later than the former. Suppose now that the two men had not seen each other for some time and were then reunited. It could happen, and in today's words this sounds indeed strange, that if the younger person were to address the older one, the latter might not recognize him. The metamorphosis would have completely transformed his memory. Because in these very ancient times, people around the age of 30 tended to forget all they had experienced previously, it was the custom in the small communities of the time to record events in young people's lives in order to inform them of their earlier experiences after they had passed through the profound transformation. And then when such people realized they had become different persons in their 30th year, that they had to go to the record office, to use a modern expression, in order to learn of their earlier experiences. Yes, it really happened this way. Then at the same time they were also taught that before their 30th year only moon forces had acted upon them, whereas now sun forces were entering into their development. The sun force's influence on the human being is entirely different from that of the moon forces. Of course, people today know little of sun forces, for they know only their external, physical effects. They know, for example, that because of sun forces, pardon my bluntness, they sweat, feel hot. They are also no doubt aware of sunbathing and its therapeutic uses, but this is all superficial. The average person nowadays cannot even begin to conceive of the effect that the forces spiritually connected with the sun have upon him. Julian the Apostate, the last of the pagan Caesars, acquired some knowledge of the sun forces in the dwindling mysteries, and was murdered on his expedition to Persia because he wanted to make it official again. That is how strong the powers that wanted to exterminate such knowledge in the early Christian centuries were. It is therefore not surprising that no knowledge of such matters has survived. While the moon forces determine the human being, permeate us with an inner necessity, so that we must act according to our instincts, our temperament, our emotions, in a word, our whole physical and etheric nature, the spiritual sun forces free us from this. They dissolve, so to speak, the forces of compulsion, and it is really through their agency that we become free. In ancient times, the influence of the moon and that of the sun were sharply divided. Around the age of 30, people simply became sun people, that is, free, whereas up until then they had been moon people, or unfree. Nowadays these two overlap. Even in childhood the sun forces act along with the moon forces, and the moon forces continue to work on us in later years. Thus in our time necessity and freedom intermingle. As has been said, however, this was not always the case. In the prehistoric times of which we have been speaking, the effects of the moon and the sun upon human life were sharply separated. It was considered pathological when someone failed to experience the metamorphosis, the new beginning in his 30th year. By the same token, people spoke of having been born not once, but twice. As humanity began to develop in such a way that the second, or solar birth, the first was called the lunar birth, became less noticeable, certain facts, including exercises and cult rituals, began to be applied to initiates in the mysteries. In this way, the initiates experienced something that the rest of mankind no longer did. They were now twice born. The term twice born, that may be found in ancient Oriental writings even today, no longer carries its original meaning. It would be interesting to ask every Orientalist and Sanskrit scholar, I believe our friend Professor Beck is in our midst. You can ask him how things stand according to his professional studies, whether they think modern scholarship can explain the meaning of this expression clearly and in no uncertain terms. In fact, any number of formal analyses are available, but the essential meaning remains a mystery. Only those who know it derives from such a reality as I have just described can grasp its true meaning. About such things, spiritual observation does, after all, have something to say, and once it has spoken, I would challenge any unprejudiced researcher in a conventional academic discipline to prove that existing documents do not at every step bear it out. Ordinary science will confirm spiritual research, provided things are seen in the right light. But certain things transcending ordinary science must be brought to light, since the study of documents cannot lead to a true understanding of human life. Thus we look back to an ancient time when people spoke of their lunar birth as of a creation by the Father. Regarding their solar birth, people understood that in the sun's spiritual rays, Christ's power, the power of the sun, S-O-N, is active, and that it sets human beings free. Consider what it does for us. Only through its action can we make something of ourselves in earthly life. Without the liberating forces and impulses of the sun, we would be strictly predestined, at the mercy of an inexorable determinism, and not even the determinism of fate, but merely that of nature. People in ancient times knew this. To them the sun was a celestial eye, S-U-N. To them the S-U-N sun was a celestial eye, E-Y-E, from which the power of Christ streamed forth. They knew that this power released them from the bondage of iron necessity, into which the moon forces had placed them at birth, and which would otherwise govern their entire lives. The sun forces, the Christ forces, looking down upon them through the cosmic eye of the sun, E-Y-E and S-U-N, enable them to make something of themselves in inner freedom. Something they could not have become merely by virtue of the moon forces. Thus, in the sun forces, people saw the possibility of transforming or making something of themselves here on earth. For completeness' sake, I should briefly mention that ancient people also looked to the forces of Saturn, in which they saw all that sustains us when we pass through the portal of death. That is, when we experience the third earthly metamorphosis. Physical birth, moon. Second birth, sun. Third birth, physical death, Saturn. After death, the human being is maintained by the Saturn forces that reign at what was, in ancient times, considered to be the outer limit of our planetary system. These forces support us and carry us out into the spiritual world. They maintain our being's integrity when the third metamorphosis occurs. This was unquestionably the worldview of ancient times. But humanity changes, and the time came when the sun force's effects were known only in the mysteries. This knowledge survived longest in the mysteries' therapeutic sections, because the same forces that give us our freedom, our ability to make something of ourselves, namely the sun forces, the Christ forces, are also found in certain plants and in other earthly beings and substances, which, as a result, possess healing properties. For the most part, however, human beings lost this knowledge of the sun. Although knowledge of our dependence on the moon or father forces remained with people for a long time, consciousness of our dependence on the sun forces, or we must really say of our emancipation through those forces, disappeared much earlier. And what we today call forces of nature, which seem to be the sole topic in modern philosophy, are really nothing but a complete abstract version of the moon forces. One person who still knew the sun forces and was able to let himself be guided by them was the Christ-bearer, Jesus of Nazareth. He had to know them. For whereas in the old mysteries the sun forces could be reached only by looking up spiritually to the sun, it was the mission of Jesus of Nazareth to receive these forces in his own body as they streamed down to earth. This I explained yesterday. The essential point, however, is that in his 30th year a transformation occurred in Jesus of Nazareth's body. It was the same transformation everyone experienced in primeval times, except that in those times only the rays, so to speak, of the spiritual sun entered into people, whereas here the primordial sun, being himself, the Christ, descended into human evolution and dwelt in the body of Jesus of Nazareth. This event, central to all earthly life, is at the root of the mystery of Golgotha. You will be able to understand these things in their full significance if you consider the way Easter was celebrated in the older mysteries. Easter, one might say, was as yet a human affair, for it was initiation. Basic initiation consisted of 3 stages. The very first requirement for initiation was to develop, through exposure to what the mysteries had to offer, a degree of inner humility we cannot fathom today. Although today people do indeed consider themselves enormously modest with respect to knowledge, anyone who can see through them knows they are truly possessed by arrogance. Above all, at the outset of initiation, the candidate had to believe that he was not yet really human, that this was a goal yet to be achieved. Today it would be asking too much of people at any stage of life that they should not consider themselves human beings. But for initiation, this was the very first requirement. The candidate had to know that it was only before descending into an earthly body that he had been a human being, that in pre-earthly existence he had been a human being of soul and spirit, which then entered a physical body provided by a natural mother, by the natural parents. It did not clothe itself with the body, for that is an inaccurate expression. Rather, it permeated itself with a physical body. Now, just how, over a long period of time, the spirit and soul pervade the physical body, the nervous sensory system, the rhythmic system, the metabolic limb system, is something most people are not aware of. What everyone is aware of, what everyone perceives through the senses, is the physical world around us. When spirit and soul have completed their permeation of our physical bodies at adulthood, we can only look to the outside with our eyes, listen with our ears to what is outside us, perceive warmth and cold, roughness and smoothness outside us through our skin. In other words, we perceive only what is outside, not what is inside us. We cannot look into ourselves with our eyes. The most we can do is to dissect a human corpse and imagine we are looking into ourselves, but in reality we are not. Suppose I have a house here before me. It has windows, but I do not look in through them. Instead, I take some tools, and if I am strong enough, I can demolish the house. The individual bricks then lie before me in a heap. They are all that is left of the house. This is the way things are done today. People dissect the human being, cut him up in order to get to know him. But in this way they do not get to know him. What they get to know this way is not at all a human being. To really know ourselves, we must be able, just as today we look out of our eyes, to look in through them, to listen in with our ears, and so on. All this taken together, eyes, ears, the whole skin as an organ of touch and temperature, was called in the mysteries the door to the human being. Initiation started from the candidate's realization that he knew nothing about the human being, and that having no consciousness of himself as human, he could not really claim to be one. He would first have to learn to look in through his senses, in the same way he otherwise looks out. That was the first stage of initiation in the old mysteries. And the moment a person learned in this way to look inside himself, he experienced how he had been in pre-earthly existence, for then he knew himself to be a being of spirit and soul. The initiate thus learned to look in instead of out, and in so doing became aware of what had entered him as pre-earthly existence through his eyes, ears, skin, and so forth. Aware now that he had had such an existence, he was told that now he could begin to acquaint himself with what today we would call natural science. When we learn about natural science today, we are taught to observe the phenomena of nature, to describe them, and so on. But this is analogous to being told, upon meeting someone we have known for a long time, to forget everything we have ever had in common with that person. Fancy, if you will, a married couple being told upon seeing one another after a long separation to forget everything they had ever been through together. Well, yes, I can imagine that once in a while such a thing might actually be preferable, but life could not be carried on in that way. Such, however, are exactly the circumstances imposed upon us by our modern system of civilization. We all become acquainted with the kingdoms of nature from their spiritual aspect before we descend to earth. And while today people are encouraged to forget all they learned then about minerals, plants, and animals, the old initiate, in the so-called first mystery stage, attempted to remember it. He was shown, for example, a quartz crystal, and then everything possible was done to remind him of what he had known about quartz, or about lilies, or roses, before he descended to earth. The knowledge of nature taught in the mysteries was essentially recognition. After a candidate had mastered the method of recollecting everything viewed in pre-earthly existence, he was admitted to the second stage, which consisted of learning the music, architecture, geometry, surveying, etc. of the time. This was because the second stage comprised everything a person could learn, not only by looking inside with his eyes and listening to what is inside him with his ears, but by actually entering into himself. Here the candidate for initiation was told he was entering the temple grotto of man, which was the part of himself physically permeated by the soul spiritual forces of which he had consisted before descending to life on earth. Into this he penetrated. The temple grotto, he was told, consisted of 3 chambers. The first was the chamber of thought. There he became acquainted with everything. Well, yes, when looked at externally, it is the human head, which is small, but when entered into and viewed from within, it is as big as the world. The candidate came to know himself there as spirit. That was the first chamber. In the second he acquainted himself with feeling, and in the third with willing. In this way initiates learned how the human being is organized with respect to the organs of thinking, feeling, and willing. They acquainted themselves, that is, with what matters on earth. Knowledge of nature, on the other hand, transcends such merely earthly matters. One acquires it before one even descends to earth. After that, it is simply a question of recalling it. By contrast, no houses are built in the spiritual world with earthly architecture. Similarly, the music that exists in the spiritual world is entirely spiritual. Earthly music is merely its projection into the terrestrial air. Surveying is concerned with the dimensions of the earth. Both it and geometry are earthly sciences. It was important for the novice of the second stage to realize that all talk of gaining knowledge by purely earthly means, except as it applies to geometry, architecture, and surveying, is nonsense. He realized that a genuine science of nature must consist of recalling pre-earthly knowledge. However, geometry, architecture, music, and surveying are sciences that can be learned here on earth. The candidate thus entered into himself and came to know the cosmic human being. This consisted of 3 chambers, unlike the single earthly organization we encounter by approaching the human being only from the outside. In the third stage, the candidate not only delved down into himself, coming to know himself spiritually, but as spirit he came to know the body as well. Initiates in all the old mysteries called this level of knowledge, quote, the portal of death, close quote. Here one learned what it is like to lay aside the earthly body. There was, however, a difference between actual death and the death experienced in initiation. I will explain in the following lectures why this had to be so. At the moment, I only want to point out the facts. When we die, we discard our physical bodies and are no longer bound to them. We cease to respond to and are henceforth free from earth forces. But while we are still connected to our physical bodies, as was the case in the initiations of old, we must achieve by inner exertion something that in death happens of itself, namely, freedom from the body, We must hold ourselves outside the body for a time. Initiation required that one attain strong inner forces of soul, by virtue of which one could remain free from the physical body. These same forces also provided higher knowledge of matters that could neither be perceived with the senses nor thought with the intellect. They brought human beings into relation with the spiritual world, just as our physical bodies bring us into relation with the physical world. At this point, a candidate was far enough advanced to recognize himself as a human being of spirit and soul, as an initiate, while still living on earth. From that time on, he experienced the earth as outside himself, and could live with the sun rather than with the earth, particularly in the older mysteries. He knew what he had from the sun, how the sun forces were active in him. After this third stage followed then the fourth. The fourth stage was an effect that may be explained as follows. When a human being on earth eats, he recognizes, for example, that he is eating cabbage or venison. He can drink various things, and know that first these things are outside, then inside him. He breathes the air, first it is outside, then inside, then outside again. In short, he carries within him earthly forces and substances that also exist outside him. What the mysteries made clear to the student was that before initiation he had been an earth-bearer, a bearer of cabbage, venison, pork, and so on, but that upon completing the third stage of initiation and experiencing what it is possible to experience when one frees oneself from the body, he would no longer be a bearer of cabbage, pork, and veal, but rather of what the sun forces gave him. In all the mysteries, this spiritual gift of the sun forces was called Christos. Hence the candidate who had gone through the three stages and now felt himself to be a bearer of the sun forces, just as he had been a cabbage bearer on earth, was called a Christopher, a Christ bearer. This was the term applied to a neophyte of the fourth stage in most of the ancient mysteries. In the third stage, the candidate had to understand certain things thoroughly, most importantly that his craving for the physical body had to cease during moments of knowledge. He had to understand that the human being, as far as the physical body is concerned, belongs to the earth, but that the earth actually only destroys the physical body and does not build it up. It was at this point that the initiate came to know the upbuilding forces that originate in the cosmos. He also learned something else. Precisely when he became a Christopher, the initiate realized that spiritual forces are at work even in the substances of the earth, albeit in a way imperceptible to earthly senses. Had our modern way of speaking, which is the only one I can use, been comprehensible to people of ancient times, the sense of what the neophyte was told might be expressed as follows, quote, "If you wish to know and understand substance, to see how the different elements combine and separate, you must look to the spiritual forces that permeate matter from the cosmos. You can only do this, however, once you have been initiated into the fourth stage, for only when you are able to perceive by means of forces of the sun existence will you be able to study chemistry." Close quote. Now, in our time, it would be thought quite absurd, wouldn't it, to require of candidates for the doctor's degree in pharmacology or chemistry that they experience sun forces in the same way that they do earthly cabbage. In the old days, however, such demands were made. Furthermore, initiates realized that all the forces of ordinary cognition alive in the body can be used only to study geometry, surveying, music, and architecture. They are useless for the study of chemistry. Chemistry, as we know it today, deals only with superficial realities, and has done so ever since the old initiation wisdom was lost. In fact, anyone who seeks genuine knowledge must despair at having to learn the official chemistry of today, for it is based wholly upon descriptions, not upon an inner penetration of the subject. If people were open-minded, they would realize that something more is necessary, that a different method of cognition is required for a true study of chemistry. That this is not realized is simply the result of the cowardice so prevalent today. When a candidate had passed the 4th stage, he was ready to become an adept in astronomy, which was an even higher stage of initiation. The merely external study of the stars, based on calculations and the like, ancient people considered thoroughly trivial. For the stars are inhabited by spiritual beings, and these beings can be known only after physical observation and even geometry have been left behind, when one can literally live in the universe and know the spiritual nature of the stars. At this stage, the candidate became one of the resurrected, and could observe the forces of the moon and sun at work, particularly in their effects upon earthly humanity. Today I have described for you from 2 sides how Easter was inwardly experienced in the old mysteries, not in a particular season, but at a certain stage of human development. Easter, we have seen, was the inner human being's resurrection out of the physical body into the spiritual universe. Those still cognizant of ancient mystery wisdom at the time of the mystery of Golgotha saw that mystery in this light. They asked themselves what would have happened to humanity if the mystery of Golgotha had not taken place. In ancient times it had been possible to be initiated into the secrets of the cosmos, for even earlier than that it had been a matter of course for people to experience a second birth around their 30th year. Memories of this had been preserved, as had the knowledge of the mystery schools, and thus what had been experienced directly in earlier epochs was kept alive as tradition. At the time of the mystery of Golgotha, however, this had all been lost or forgotten. Humanity would have fallen into complete decadence had not the power to whom the initiates had raised themselves in becoming Christophers descended into Jesus of Nazareth and remained on earth since then, enabling people to unite themselves with it through Christ Jesus. Easter, as we know it today, is thus a link in the evolution of the mysteries, and we can become aware of its true content only by reviving that evolution. In the lectures to come, you will be able to get at least an idea of what the ancients experienced in initiation. A new initiate could say to himself, quote, "Initiation has revealed to me how sun and moon, as celestial opposites, work within me. I know now that my physical form, the particular shape of my eyes, nose, indeed my entire body, inside and out, as well as the fact that this form could grow and continues to grow through nourishment, is a result of the moon forces. Upon them all necessity depends. But that I can come to life within my physical body, as a free human being, that I can alter my character and master myself, this is due to the sun forces, to the Christ forces. These I must awaken within me, if I am to achieve through my own efforts a conscious freedom over and above that given me by the sun forces through another kind of necessity." Close quote. From all this one can understand why even today human beings calculate the date of Easter from a particular constellation of sun and moon. All that remains of the old consciousness is an interest in finding the first Sunday, following the first full moon after the spring equinox. That Easter is set on that Sunday indicates, as I shall elaborate tomorrow, that people see in Easter's nature and form something that must be determined from above, that is, from the cosmos. More than this, however, is necessary. The very content of Easter must be grasped anew, and this can happen only if we examine the old mysteries. These showed, first of all, what people could experience if they looked inside themselves, the portal of man. Then, when they descended into themselves and came to know the remotest inner recesses of their being, the three-chambered cosmic human being, when they liberated themselves from the body, the portal of death, and when they moved freely in the spiritual world, they became Christophers. The mysteries themselves, of course, began to disappear at the time human freedom started to assert itself. But the time to rediscover them has arrived. The mysteries must be found anew, and we should be fully conscious that preparations to that end must now be made. It was with this in mind that the Christmas conference was held. An earthly sanctuary for the refounding of the mysteries is urgently needed. The Anthroposophical Society, as it continues in its development, must lead the way to that refounding. It will be partly your task, my dear friends, to help this along in the right spirit. But for that you will need to examine the three stages of human life: introspection, self-penetration, and a consciousness one has in outer reality only in death. As a reminder of what has been said in this hour, I would like us now to carry away and meditate upon the following words. Stand at the gate of living man. View in its arch stones cosmic thoughts. Live deep within the human soul. Feel at its center the birth of worlds. Think upon man's earthly ending. Find there renewal of the spirit. And I'll try the German, but that's the end of the lecture otherwise. Steh vor des Menschen Lebenspforte, schau in ihrer Stirne Weltenworte, leb in des Menschen Seeleninnern, fühl in seinem Kreise Weltbeginnen, denk an des Menschen Erdenende, find bei ihm die Geisteswende. The end of Lecture 2. You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. This is a reading of a small collection of lectures by Rudolf Steiner entitled The Easter Festival in the Evolution of the Mysteries. This is Lecture 3, given on April 21st, 1924. As an extension of my comments of the last few days, I would like today to take a closer look at the astronomical aspect of Easter. To do this, however, I will first have to touch upon certain facts relating to the so-called mystery of the moon. For as long as there was mystery knowledge, people spoke of a secret of the moon. Inasmuch as human beings participate in the cosmos as a whole, this secret was related to human nature. It must be understood that with respect to our whole nature, we are connected with the cosmos, just as, through our physical bodies, we are connected with the earth. Our materialistic times, however, have deprived us of the ancient awareness of the spirituality pervading the universe, spirituality that lives in the forms of constellations and in the motions of heavenly bodies. Our perception of heavenly bodies is now purely external. All we can do with them is calculate their movements, as we do with the planets. Such an approach to astronomy, however, is like studying the human organism while ignoring that it is animated by a being of soul and spirit. Attending only to measurable quantities and to mechanical laws of motion, we overlook the spirit and soul that express themselves through these phenomena. This spirit and soul, as they manifest themselves in the human being, are unified by the ego into a single entity, whereas in the cosmos as a whole, we have to do in spiritual observation, not with one, but with a multitude, an immeasurable, limitless multitude of spiritual beings. Some of these express themselves in the forms of the constellations, others in the wanderings of the planets, still others in the radiant light of the stars, and so on. This many-faceted heavenly spirituality is related to humanity's inner nature in the same way that earthly foodstuffs are related to our physical nature. The secret of the moon represents the most basic of these inner relations between us and the cosmos. To the earthly eye, EYE, the moon appears engaged in a constant metamorphosis. From a round, luminous disk, such as we see now, it diminishes to half, then to a quarter, until finally it vanishes from sight in a phenomenon we call the new moon. This is followed by a gradual growth in size, back to the full moon. The usual explanation for this is, of course, that the moon is just a body that moves about in space and is illuminated from different angles by the sun, so that its shape apparently changes. Such an explanation, however, does not encompass everything the moon means to Earth and to earthly humanity. Instead, it must be realized that when we look at something as physically conspicuous as the full moon, something that presents us with a physical aspect, we are dealing with a completely different thing than when the same object presents itself to us as the new moon, which obviously cannot manifest itself in a visible physical way due to the celestial configuration connected with it. However, we must not conclude from this that the new moon is completely without effect. When the state of the heavens is such that we know the moon to be new, it is simply a matter of the moon being present in an invisible and therefore more spiritual manner than when it appears in the physical light as full moon. The moon is therefore present at one time in a completely physical way, at another in a completely spiritual way, always rhythmically alternating between these two forms of expression. In order to understand why this is so, it is necessary to recall certain facts with which you may be familiar from the account I give of them in my outline of esoteric science. We must particularly call to mind that the moon was once inside the earth. It was a part of it. Then it split away, becoming a satellite, as they say, and since then has orbited around it. But during the time when it was still joined with the earth, it acted upon human beings from within it. Humanity, of course, lived and developed completely differently on the earth when it still had the moon within it. Earth was impoverished when the moon split off, because the forces by which humanity was shaped and held fast from then on were entirely earthly, rather than both earthly and lunar. Lunar forces that once acted upon human beings from within the earth now exert their influence from without. At one time the lunar forces radiated into the human being from below upward, affecting first the feet and legs, and coursing upward from there into the entire body. Since the moon split off, however, these forces have acted in the opposite direction, from the head downward, and in doing so have acquired a completely different role in the life of humanity from the one they had previously. Where do we see this different function of the moon? In descending from pre-earthly existence to a new life on earth, the human being has very definite experiences. When he has undergone everything necessary in the period between death and a new birth, the human being prepares to come down to earth, to unite himself with a physical body provided by an earthly father and mother. But before his ego and astral body can unite themselves with a physical body, he must clothe himself in an etheric body, which he gathers from the surrounding cosmos. It is here that the new role of the lunar forces comes to expression, for this process has changed fundamentally since the moon separated from the earth. Prior to that time, human beings who had completed the life between death and a new birth, and again approached earth, needed forces to gather the ether, which is scattered throughout the cosmos, around their ego and astral bodies, in order to fashion from it the shape of their etheric bodies. Such forces were provided by the moon from within the earth. Since the moon split off, human beings have obtained the necessary forces from outside the earth, that is, from the moon. Immediately before they enter earthly existence, then, human beings must call upon what lies in the moon forces, that is, upon something cosmic, in order to fashion their etheric bodies. This etheric body must be shaped in such a way that it has, so to speak, an outside and an inside. This may be depicted as follows, and there's a picture. In fashioning the outer side of the etheric body, human beings need forces of light, for in addition to other substances, the etheric body is composed primarily of the streaming light of the cosmos. Sunlight, however, is of no use for this. Sunlight cannot bestow the forces that enable human beings to shape their etheric bodies. To obtain these, we need the light that shines from the sun, in the moon, and from the sun to the moon, and is then reflected back. For in this process the light is essentially changed. All the light we receive from the moon, the light that the moon sends out into the cosmos, contains the forces we need to form the outside of our etheric bodies. Conversely, the spiritual forces that radiate from the new moon are the ones we need to shape the inside of our etheric bodies. Thus, our ability to form the outside and inside of our etheric bodies is related to the moon's rhythmic alternation between light and darkness. And this is possible only because the moon, contrary to the idle chatter of modern science, is really more than just a body in space. In reality, it is permeated with spirit. It bears a multiplicity of spiritual beings within it. On various occasions I've explained that when the moon separated from the earth, not only did physical matter stream out into space, but also a class of spiritual beings who had lived on earth in spiritual rather than physical form, and who were mankind's original teachers. These beings went with the moon into space and founded a sort of lunar colony. We must therefore distinguish between the moon's physical etheric and its soul-spirit aspects, keeping in mind that the latter is a multiplicity rather than a unity. The activity of the moon's spiritual beings is entirely determined by how they view the surrounding world from their standpoint. To express myself pictorially, these beings first direct their gaze to what is most important to them, namely to the planets. All occurrences on the moon, including those that assure human beings of the forces they need to fashion their etheric bodies, depend upon the results of observations that the beings living in the moon make of our solar system's planets, Mercury, Sun, Moon, and so on. This was known in certain of the old mysteries. Initiates of such mysteries were aware that the moon beings acted according to observations of the planets' positions and motions. This was expressed by bringing the moon, by which celestial configurations important to the fashioning of the human etheric body were determined, into human awareness and in connection with the other planetary forces. This was done by means of the names given to the days of the week: Moon, Monday. Monday, from this point the other planets could be observed. Mars, Mars' day, in French Mardi, Tuesday. Mercury, Mercury's day, Mercredi, Wednesday. Jupiter, Jupiter's day, Jupiter being the German Donner, Donnerstag, Thursday. Venus, the German Freya, Freitag, Friday. Saturn, Saturn's day, Saturday, and finally the Sun, whose forces cannot directly influence the etheric body's formation, but rather only indirectly, by reflection from the moon, Sunday. In this way the moon's viewpoint was incorporated into a structuring of time that reminded human beings of the entire planetary context. In this way the ancient mysteries attempted to awaken people's memories of pre-earthly existence, of a time when they had needed forces created on the moon by the moon beings' observation of the planets. People were to be reminded that they owed the particular form of their etheric bodies to what the moon had been able to glean from Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and so on. Thus we have on the one hand the moon's rhythmic oscillation between light and darkness as it orbits around the earth, and on the other the entire planetary system, inscribed into human consciousness by the names of days of the week. And to this the mysteries could add even more. They taught, for example, that because the moon beings can look toward Mars, we receive etheric bodies endowed with the capacity for speech. Likewise, because the moon beings can observe Mercury, our etheric bodies are infused with the capacity for movement. In fact, if we consider these same teachings from an altogether different point of view, we can discover how eurythmy arises from human speech. Eurythmy develops out of speech when we explore the mysteries of speech by asking the moon beings about their observations of Mars, and then watch how these observations change when they shift their gaze to Mercury. If we transform the Mars experiences of the moon beings into their Mercury experiences, then we see the capacity for eurythmy develop out of our capacity for speech. This is the cosmic perspective on how speech is metamorphosed into eurythmy. The capacity for wisdom that lives within us is made possible by the moon beings' experiences of Jupiter. Our ability to love and to appreciate beauty derives from their experiences of Venus. Inner warmth of soul is planted into our etheric bodies by what the moon beings learn from observing Saturn. And in order that our etheric body's formation not be disturbed during the period immediately preceding our descent to earth, everything that derives from the sun is kept at a distance. One could almost say it is pushed away. It is from the sun, or rather from the sight of the sun, that protective forces must shield us if we are to become self-contained beings through the formation of an etheric body. In this way we come to know what takes place on the moon, as well as how the etheric body is fashioned as the human being descends from pre-earthly into earthly existence. These are the facts I mentioned relating to the secret of the moon. Such things may be spoken of today. In certain of the older mysteries, they were not merely spoken of, but actually lived through. What I wrote on the blackboard was not just known, but inwardly experienced. Monday, Tuesday, language; Wednesday, movement; Thursday, wisdom; Friday, love, beauty; Saturday, inner warmth of soul; Sunday, protective forces. The mysteries of which I spoke to you yesterday enabled initiates to transcend the merely external use of their bodily senses, to free or distance themselves from their physical bodies, and to live exclusively in their etheric bodies. When they did so, however, they lived with all the realities of which I have just spoken. Rather than the speech that is formed in the larynx, they experienced the cosmic language that resonates from Mars. Their movements, too, were in harmony with the guidance Mercury exerts over the cosmos. They moved, that is, not with feet and legs, but in their essential being, in accordance with Mercury's direction. And instead of having the wisdom we normally acquire with such difficulty as we progress through childhood and youth, nowadays it is really a lack of wisdom, the initiates lived entirely within the wisdom of Jupiter, not directly, but by uniting themselves with the moon beings who observed it. Through this form of initiation, one could live entirely in the moon's radiant light. One actually left the earth. No longer a being of earthly flesh and blood, one lived within the moonlight, but in the moonlight structured and modified by what lived in the other planets of the solar system. Through this kind of spiritual observation, one actually became a light being of the moon. This must not be taken symbolically or abstractly. Just as today, when we take a walk into Basel and back, we are fully conscious that what we are experiencing is real, so at that time, people could be conscious of actually paying the moon beings a visit through initiation. Initiates were conscious of taking leave for a while of their physical bodies, and of moving into the moon's luminous realm as beings of spirit and soul. Clothed in bodies of light and united with the moon beings, they could gaze out into the solar system and observe what revealed itself there. Primary among the things they observed was that sun-beings exerted forces that could not be permitted to play any part in the fashioning of the human etheric body. They perceived, that is, that the sun tends to disintegrate or destroy the etheric body. And for that reason they knew that the forces emanating from the sun beings must be received by the higher human members, the ego and the astral body, but not by the etheric body. Only upon the higher members could the sun forces be allowed to work. For the etheric body, on the other hand, one turned not to the sun, but to the planets. For the astral body, and even more so for the ego's full inner power, one had to turn to the sun. This was the second thing revealed by the mysteries that had access to the secret of the moon. Initiates knew that through their etheric bodies they belonged to the system of the planets, but that their ego forces in particular, and also those of their astral bodies, derived from the sun. In other words, through this form of initiation, they became one with the moonlight, but looked at the same time toward the sun. Initiates grasped that the sun shines its light upon the moon, because it may not directly transmit that light to human beings. We then have moonlight in conjunction with the influences of the planets, out of which, as we have seen, the human etheric body is fashioned. That was the knowledge conveyed by this particular form of initiation, which thus also revealed the extent to which an initiate carried within himself the power of the spiritual sun. The initiate observed this directly, achieving thereby the level of a Christ-bearer. He became the bearer of a sun being, not a vessel, but a bearer. Just as the moon itself, when it is full, is a sunlight bearer, the initiate became a Christ-bearer, a Christopher. His initiation into this was a thoroughly real experience. He escaped from the earth and ascended to become a being of light. Now try to imagine this real experience, this earlier inner Easter experience, transformed into a cosmic festival. In later times, people no longer knew that they could rise above the earthly, unite themselves spiritually with the moon, and from there observe the sun. However, a reminder of all this had to be preserved, and it was preserved in the Easter festival. Although in later times people with a more materialistic outlook could not recognize the possibility of such experiences, they did retain an abstract recollection of them. Rather than looking within themselves and knowing that they could unite themselves with the moonlight, they looked up to the full moon, imagining that not they, but rather the entire earth was striving up toward it. At no time could this be experienced more strongly than at the beginning of spring, when forces rise upward from the earth's surface out of the seeds buried in it. Even after developing into plants, these forces continue to stream upward into the cosmos. In the ancient mysteries, it was known that human beings could most readily achieve the lunar and solar initiation and become Christophers when the earth's inner forces streamed up in this way into the cosmos through the stems and leaves of plants. The mysteries represented this in the image of a human being floating upward on these forces toward the moon. This could only happen, however, when the moon was full. Something of this knowledge survived into later times, but it became abstract. Quote, "The moon must be full," close quote. Dimly, no longer realizing it could be an actual human experience, people subconsciously imagined something other than themselves streaming upward in the spring toward the first full moon. The moon itself, they thought, then looked toward the sun, that is, toward the first following Sunday. In other words, instead of a Christopher looking at the sun from his newly gained vantage point in the moon, people imagined that the moon looked at the sun, that is, at its symbolization in Sunday. Thus we have the following sequence: March 21st, full moon, Sunday. March 21st is the beginning of spring. The earth's forces burgeon forth into the cosmos. One must then wait until the proper observer, the full moon, is there. The moon then observes the sun, making the following Sunday Easter. Our method for fixing Easter's date is thus an abstract vestige of what was once a thoroughly real mystery procedure, one that in ancient times many people experienced. This procedure, however, is different from the one I described the day before yesterday. The latter, as you will recall, led to an understanding of the nature of death. I said that the process of resurrection, which was symbolized by the rituals of the Adonis cult and of others like it, demanded that one first undergo a kind of death experience in order to rise in the spiritual world after 3 days. For reasons I have already set forth, this resurrection process took place in the fall. By contrast, the procedure I have described today was celebrated or enacted in a different set of mysteries, those conferring the solar and lunar initiation. It carried the initiates back before the beginning of earthly life. Thus we look back to a time when certain mysteries recognized our descent from pre-earthly into earthly life, while others, the autumnal mysteries, recognized our ascent into the spiritual. In later times, however, when people no longer sensed this living relationship between themselves and the cosmos, the autumnal mystery of ascent was mistakenly combined with the spring mystery of descent. Here materialism began to show its effects. For materialism not only gave rise to false opinions, it cast people into total confusion concerning things that had previously lent a kind of sacred order to human existence. Part of that sacred order was that when fall came, a cosmic festival was observed that pointed toward a mystery procedure, the spirit of which might be captured by the following words, quote, "Nature is falling into decay, withering away. In this it resembles the decay of our own physical being. However, even as we look at nature, perceiving only transient things, the eternal lives within us. This must be viewed with spiritual eyes and is not affected by what happens in nature. After death it rises again in the spiritual world." Close quote. Through the spring mysteries, on the other hand, humanity realized that nature is overcome by the Spirit. Spirit works in from the cosmos, causing physical life to burgeon and sprout forth from the earth. People were thus reminded not of how we proceed into the spiritual world at death, but rather of how we emerge from it and descend to earth. In other words, precisely when nature was on the rise, human beings were reminded of their descent into the physical, while when nature fell into decay, they were to reflect upon their rise, their resurrection into the spiritual. You can imagine the extent to which inner life was deepened by this experience of humanity's relation to the cosmos. Different regions stressed different festivals. In ancient times, there really were peoples who were more autumnal, while others were more vernal. The autumnal peoples celebrated mysteries like those of Adonis. The others had mysteries based upon such realities as I have described today. Only people of whom it is reported, and correctly so, that they traveled like Pythagoras from place to place, from mystery center to mystery center, seeking knowledge, were able to have the entire range of human experience. Traveling from one place to another, they might at one time behold the autumnal mystery, which is actually the mystery of the sun, and at another the spring mystery, which is the mystery of the moon. This is why the ancient universal initiates are always portrayed as traveling from one mystery center to another, and it may truly be said that they thereby inwardly experience the year through the various festivals. Coming to a place where an Adonis festival was celebrated, they might say, quote, "I behold the cosmic autumn and the radiance of the spiritual sun at the onset of winter's night." Close quote. Where a spring mystery was celebrated, they might say, quote, "I behold the mystery of the moon." Close quote. In this way they came to know the year's full inner meaning. Thus, as you can see, Easter, as we know it today, is encumbered with things that do not really belong to it. It should really be a ceremony of burial, one that goads us into working, just as the spring festivals did for ancient peoples. Such festivals gave them the spiritual incentives they needed for work in the summer. In other words, Easter was an admonishment to prepare for the summer's work. By contrast, the fall festival of resurrection was celebrated at a time when human beings left work behind. In leaving it behind, however, they experienced within themselves something of supreme importance to beings of spirit and soul, namely an awakening to the eternal in them. This they experienced by contemplating the soul's resurrection in the spiritual world 3 days after death. By proceeding from earthly mysteries to cosmic mysteries, from earthly knowledge to cosmic knowledge, we thus begin to recognize the year's inner structure as revealed through the festivals, even though much of the festival's hidden meaning has been lost. Tomorrow, as time permits, I will try to go more deeply into matters that have been described today in more general cosmic terms by focusing on particular mystery centers. The end of Lecture 3. You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. This is a reading of a small set of lectures entitled The Easter Festival in the Evolution of the Mysteries. This is the last lecture, Lecture 4, given on April 22nd, 1924. We have seen how the mysteries provided human beings with a conscious connection to the world in such a way that this connection could be portrayed in the yearly cycle of festivals. In particular, we have seen how Easter developed out of the principle of initiation. It should be obvious from all that has been said that the mysteries played a highly significant role in humanity's development. Indeed, in ancient times, essentially all of humanity's spiritual life and development originated within the mysteries. To put it in modern terms, the mysteries wielded great power in the overall guidance of spiritual life. Human beings, however, were destined to achieve freedom, which meant that the mysteries' powerful influence had to diminish and for a time leave human beings more or less to their own devices. Although today it can hardly be said that we have already achieved true inner freedom and are ready to proceed with the next evolutionary step, still a significant number of people have gone through incarnations in which the power of the mysteries has been less palpable than it was in earlier times. The fruit of these incarnations, although not yet ripe, is alive in people's souls. And when an age finally dawns that is once again more spiritual, the current ignorance will be overcome. People will then freely greet with esteem and reverence the spiritual knowledge and experience that can be achieved through modern initiation. For without esteem and reverence, neither knowledge nor humanity's spiritual life would be possible. One of the purposes of the festivals is to try to cultivate this reverence in ourselves by understanding how the spiritual has developed throughout human history. Through the festivals, we can learn to look very intimately at how historical events pass spiritual contents on from one age to another. For even though human beings are the most fundamental link in the chain of historical development, in that they reincarnate, and thereby carry experiences of earlier epochs into later ones, nevertheless each life is lived in a particular milieu, of which the mysteries are, of course, a highly significant part. A most important factor for the progress of humanity is the carrying of the contents of mystery experiences into later incarnations, where they are encountered again, either in new mysteries, which in turn have their effect upon humanity as a whole, or in some other form of knowledge. It is in some other form of knowledge that past mystery wisdom must be experienced in our time, for the actual mysteries have all but disappeared from outer life and must rise again. I might say that if the impulse originating from the Christmas conference that was held here at the Goetheanum truly takes hold within the Anthroposophical Society, then the society, inasmuch as it leads to the classes which have already begun to be established, will become the basis for a renewal of the mysteries. The Anthroposophical Society must consciously cultivate this renewal. The Society was, after all, witness to an event that, like the burning of the temple at Ephesus, can be turned to good historical account. In both cases a grievous wrong was perpetrated. However, what is a terrible wrong on one level can turn out to be useful for human freedom on another level. Such harrowing events can indeed call forth a true step forward in human evolution. To understand such matters, we must examine them, as I mentioned before, on as intimate a level as possible. We must look at the particular way in which the world's spirituality lived within the mysteries. As I indicated yesterday, the fixing of Easter's date grew out of a spiritual appreciation of the constellation of the sun and the moon. I also indicated that moon beings observe the planets, and that these observations guide human beings in their descent from pre-earthly into earthly life, guide them in the formation of their etheric bodies. Now, in order to understand how the lunar forces, or one might say the spiritual observatory on the moon, makes etheric forces available to human beings, we can look to the cosmos. For as we have had occasion to see, it is inscribed there, it exists there as a fact. However, it is also important to appreciate the interest human beings have taken in these matters throughout history. And that interest was nowhere more sincere than in the mysteries at Ephesus. Every aspect of the service to the goddess of Ephesus, known exoterically as Artemis, was designed to give an experience of the creative spiritual forces pervading the cosmic ether. When the participants in the mysteries approached the statue of the goddess, they had the sensation of hearing her speak in words such as this, quote, "I delight in all that bears fruit within the vast cosmic ether," close quote. To hear the goddess thus express her heartfelt delight in everything that grows, buds, and sprouts within the cosmic ether was a truly profound experience. Indeed, the spiritual atmosphere of Ephesus was aglow with heartfelt sympathy for all budding and sprouting things. The mysteries there were instituted in such a way that nowhere else could one find such sympathy with vegetative growth, with the budding and sprouting of the earth into the plant world. One consequence of this was that the lessons, if I may call them that dealt with the mystery of the moon, of which I spoke yesterday, could be given at Ephesus with particular force and clarity. As a result of such instruction, each student was able to experience himself as a figure of light formed by the moon. One exercise in particular directly placed a person capable of performing it into a process of building himself up out of sunlight transformed by the moon. In the midst of this, the sounds E, O, A rang forth, as if emanating from the sun. These sounds, the mystery student knew, enlivened his ego and astral body. E, O, ego, astral body. And with A, the approach of the luminous etheric body. E, O, A. As these sounds vibrated within him, he experienced himself as ego, as astral body, and as etheric body. Then, as if resounding from the earth, for the student was now outside the earth, came the sounds E, V, which mingled with the E, O, A. In this word, E, O, Va, the mystery student experienced himself as a complete human being. Through the consonants he felt a premonition of his earthly physical body. These consonants are bound up with the vowels E, O, A, which express the ego, astral body, and etheric body. It was through such immersion in the word E, O, Va that the Ephesian apprentice was able to experience the final stages of his descent out of the spiritual world. As he did so, however, he felt himself living within the light. Now, truly human, he was a sounding ego and sounding astral body within a light-filled etheric body. Sound within light. Such is the cosmic human being. In this way it was possible to take in what is visible in the cosmos, just as what happens in the Earth's physical surroundings can be taken in through the eyes. While carrying I-O-A within himself, the Ephesian student felt himself transported to the sphere of the moon, where he shared in the observations that could be made from there. In this condition he was still a human being in general, undifferentiated. Only upon descending to earth did he become man or woman. It was a pre-earthly state into which the student was transported, a state preparatory to the descent to earth. In the Ephesian mysteries, this self-elevation into the sphere of the moon was an especially vivid experience, which the initiates inwardly cherished, and whose content might be expressed in the following words, quote, "Cosmic-born being, thou clothed in light, strengthened by sun in the realm of moon's might, blessed art thou by Mars' creative ringing, and Mercury's swiftness mobility bringing, illumined by wisdom from Jupiter raying, and by Venus's beauty love portraying, so that Saturn's venerable spirit ways might consecrate thee to the world of space and time." Close quote. Every Ephesian bore this reality within himself, counting it among the most important things that permeated his being. Indeed, he felt himself to be truly human when these verses sounded in his ears, to use a somewhat trivial expression, for he associated them with a newly awakened consciousness of his connection with all the planets through his etheric body's forces. The verses, pregnant with meaning, were addressed by the cosmos to the etheric body. Quote, "Cosmic-born being, thou clothed in light, strengthened by sun in the realm of moon's might." Close quote. The human being is experiencing himself here within the power of the shining moon. Quote, "Blessed art thou by Mars' creative ringing." Close quote. Creative tones resonate forth from Mars. Then comes the force that animates our limbs, makes us into beings of movement, quote, "and by Mercury's swiftness, mobility bringing." Close quote. Jupiter sends forth its rays, quote, "illumined by wisdom from Jupiter raying," close quote, as does Venus, quote, "and by Venus's beauty love portraying," close quote. So that Saturn may gather all together and complete our inner and outer development, preparing us to descend to earth and to clothe ourselves in a physical body, so that we might live on earth as physical beings who carry the God within us, quote, "so that Saturn's venerable spirit ways might consecrate thee to the world of space and time," close quote. From these descriptions, you may gather that a brilliant inner light permeated the spiritual life of Ephesus. In fact, all that had ever been known about humanity's true stature within the cosmos was gathered and preserved there in the concept of Easter. Yesterday I mentioned that certain people wandered from place to place in order to experience the totality of mystery wisdom. Of these, many expressed wonder at the richness of the spiritual life at Ephesus. They assure us repeatedly that nowhere but there could they perceive so clearly and richly the harmony of the spheres as heard from the standpoint of the moon. The most brilliant astral light of the cosmos appeared to them there. They sensed it in the sunlight glimmering around the moon, pervading that light with spirit in the same way that the human soul pervades the physical body. Nowhere else than in Ephesus could they experience this, at least not with the same sense of joy or artistic vision. Such was the mystery center that went up in flames through the deed of a criminal or a madman. Ephesian initiates later reincarnated in Aristotle and Alexander, as I mentioned at the Christmas conference. These individualities then came into contact with what remained of the mysteries of Samothrace. As an example of how a seemingly meaningless outer coincidence can actually be of great significance in the world's spiritual evolution, I may mention, as I have before, indeed for many years now, that the temple at Ephesus was burning at the very moment as Alexander the Great was born. As it burned, however, something else happened as well. Consider for a moment how much the devotees of the temple had experienced throughout the centuries, how much spiritual light and wisdom had passed through its halls. All that was passed on to the cosmic ether by the flames. One might indeed say that the temple's continuous concealed celebration of Easter was henceforth inscribed, although in somewhat less legible characters, into the vault of the heavens, to the extent that that vault is etheric. This is also true of much other human wisdom as well. Surrounded in ancient times by temple walls, it later escaped and was written into the cosmic ether, where those who have risen to true imagination may perceive it directly. Because of this, imagination may be said to be an interpreter of the secrets of the stars. It is the key to former temple secrets now inscribed into the cosmic ether. The same thought may be expressed in another way. Imagine that you are looking at a crystal clear night sky, allowing your perceptions to sink deep into your soul. Provided you are properly prepared, the forms of the constellations, the movements of the planets will all begin to transform themselves into something like a cosmic script. And by reading this script, you will grasp the outlines of the mystery of the moon, which I set forth yesterday. Such things can be read in the cosmic script, provided the stars are no longer seen merely as objects of mathematical and mechanical calculation, but as letters of a cosmic alphabet. To continue with the Ephesian mysteries, as I mentioned, Aristotle and Alexander came into contact with the Kabirian mysteries in Samothrace, at a time when all the ancient mysteries were in decline. At Samothrace, however, these mysteries were remembered and preserved, even practiced. Under their influence, Alexander and Aristotle experienced something akin to a memory of Ephesus, in whose spiritual life both had, of course, participated in an earlier incarnation. Once more the E, O, Ah sounded forth for them, as well as the verses, quote, "Cosmic born being, thou clothed in light, strengthened by sun in the realm of moon's might. Blessed art thou by Mars' creative ringing, and Mercury's swiftness mobility bringing, illumined by wisdom from Jupiter reign, and by Venus's beauty love portraying, so that Saturn's venerable spirit ways might consecrate thee to the world of space and time." Close quote. But this was more than just a memory of times past. Rather, it gave them the strength to create something new, something unusual, and hence little regarded by humankind. Before I reveal it, you must understand just what kind of creation it was. Take any significant work of literature, for example the Bhagavad Gita or Goethe's Faust or Iphigenia, in short any work that you admire, and think about its richness and powerful content. Now, how is that content transmitted to you? Let us assume that it was transmitted in the usual way, that is, that at some point in your life you read it. Physically speaking, what precisely did you have before you? Nothing but combinations of letters of the alphabet on paper. The entire magnificent content comes to you through mere combinations of the 20-odd letters of the alphabet. But provided you can read, something comes to life through these 20-odd letters that enables you to experience the entire rich content of Goethe's Faust. On the other hand, you may decide that the alphabet is a frightfully boring thing, that such a concatenation of letters is the most abstract thing imaginable. And yet, these little abstract letters, properly combined, can give you all of Goethe's Faust. When Aristotle and Alexander heard the celestial harmonies once again at Samothrace, they realized what the burning of the temple at Ephesus had meant. They perceived that the Ephesian mysteries had been carried out by the flames into the vast cosmic ether. At that moment they became inspired to found the cosmic script, which is composed not of letters of the alphabet, but of thoughts. Thus the letters in the cosmic script were discovered, which in their own way are as abstract as the alphabet. Quantity, amount. Quality, trait. Relation, space. Time, position. Action, passion. What we have here is a collection of concepts, first introduced by Aristotle to his pupil Alexander. One can learn to use them in much the same way that one learns to use the letters of the alphabet and read the cosmic script with them. In later times, particularly in the abstract phase of scholastic logic, a very unusual thing occurred. Imagine a school in which the students are taught not to read, but rather only to learn the various letters of the alphabet in every imaginable combination, AC, AB, AE, and so on. In essence, this is what happened to Aristotelian logic. Works on logic would enumerate the above concepts, called categories. Students would learn them by heart, but not know what else to do with them next. It was as if they learned the alphabet but never learned to spell. In a way, the concepts of quantity, quality, relation, and so on are as simple as the letters of the alphabet, but knowledge of them is required in order to read in the cosmic script. Just as to read Faust, one must know the alphabet. And in essence, all past and future achievements of anthroposophy are experienced in terms of these concepts. For all the secrets of the physical and spiritual worlds are contained in them. These simple concepts, in other words, constitute the alphabet of the cosmos. Starting in the time of Alexander, the earlier direct perceptions characteristic of practices at Ephesus were replaced by something deeply hidden, something esoteric that really began to develop only during the Middle Ages, and that is embodied in the above-mentioned 8 concepts. They may actually be expanded to 10. We are learning to live more and more with these, but we must strive to keep them as alive in our souls as the letters of the alphabet are when we read any rich and spiritual work of literature. And so you see how 10 concepts, whose illuminating and effective power has yet to be rediscovered, came to embody an enormous wisdom known instinctively for thousands of years. And although this light-filled wisdom lies, as it were, in the grave, some day it will rise again. People will then be able to read once again in the cosmic script, and to experience the resurrection of what has been hidden in the time between the 2 spiritual epochs. It is, of course, our mission, my dear friends, to bring to light what has been hidden. We are here, after all, to find the human meaning of Easter. On another occasion, I said that anthroposophy is a Christmas experience, but in all its endeavors it is also an Easter experience, a resurrection experience, bound up with the experience of the grave. It is essential, particularly at an Easter gathering such as this, to experience something of the solemnity, if I may put it in that way, of our anthroposophical striving. We should sense the presence of a spiritual being just beyond the threshold, to whom we can go and say, quote, "How blessed mankind once was by divine spiritual revelation! How glorious that revelation was in the temple at Ephesus! Now all that is buried. Where must I dig for it?" Close quote. To which the being beyond the threshold will reply, just as another did on a similar occasion, quote, "What you seek is no longer there. It is in your hearts, if only you know how to open them." Close quote. Anthroposophy is indeed in people's hearts, and these hearts need only to be opened in the right way. That should be our conviction, and if it is, we shall be led back, not instinctively, as in ancient times, but in full awareness to the wisdom that lived and shone in the mysteries. I offer you these Easter words in the hope that they might reach your hearts, for by devotedly cultivating the solemn mood that anthroposophy can enkindle within our souls, we reach up into the spiritual world. At the same time, this solemn mood is connected with the Christmas impulse given at Dornach, which must not be allowed to remain abstract or intellectual, but must issue from the heart. Avoiding both joylessness and sentimentality, it must be a natural expression of the solemn facts. Just as the fire of Ephesus flared anew within the hearts of Aristotle and Alexander after scorching the cosmic ether and revealing to them the secrets that they compressed into the simplest of forms, just as they used the burning of Ephesus, so too must we, and this may be said in all modesty, be able to make use of what the flames of the Goetheanum carried out into the ether as the substance of our anthroposophical aims, both past and to come. It was in keeping with this, my dear friends, that at Christmas time, at the beginning of the new year, the very time of year in which our misfortune occurred, we were permitted to let issue forth a new impulse from the Goetheanum. Why? Because we could feel that a previously earthly concern had been carried out by the flames into the vastness of the cosmos, and that because of this misfortune, what we represent is no longer a merely earthly concern, but rather of significance for the whole cosmic etheric world. This world, filled with spiritual wisdom, has adopted the Goetheanum's cause, which was carried out by the flames. The Goetheanum impulses with which we imbue ourselves now stream in from the cosmos. Take this any way you like. Take it as a picture. But as a picture it points to a profound reality. To put it simply, since the impulse at Christmas, all anthroposophical endeavor must be infused with esotericism. This is because impulses are now working their way in from the cosmos as a result of the astral light that streamed up from the burning Goetheanum. These impulses can strengthen the anthroposophical movement, provided we are in a position to receive them. If we are, then everything anthroposophical, including the Easter mood, will be sensed as an essential part of the whole that is anthroposophy. The anthroposophical Easter mood convinces us that the spirit never dies, that though it may die to the world, it always rises again. Anthroposophy must base itself upon this spirit that rises ever anew from its eternal foundations. Such is the feeling and concept of Easter that we may take into our hearts. And from this gathering, my dear friends, we shall carry away courage and strength for our work in other places. The end of this lecture 4 and the end of this small collection of lectures by Rudolf Steiner.